Hello, everyone. My name is Israel Bartal. I am a professor of modern Jewish history at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. This time, I'm going to speak about the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The history of the Arab-Israeli conflict is quite long. Its roots go back to the middle of the 19th century. And actually, it goes back even much earlier to the late centuries of the Ottoman Empire. Let's start with having the proportions of the countries involved in this conflict. In front of you, you have the map of the Middle East with its today's boundaries. As one can see, Israel is one of the smallest countries in the region. Please note the proportions of Israeli territory as compared, for example, to the territory of countries like Iraq, Saudi Arabia, or Egypt. You can see immediately that Israel is much smaller than all its neighbors, except for one country north to Israel, Lebanon. But have in mind that these political boundaries, the frontiers between countries like Libya, Egypt, Jordan, Israel, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey are quite new. Most of them were created only in the beginning of the 20th century, and except for one border between Israel and Egypt, all other boundaries were created as a result of the First World War after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. One can easily see also that Israel sits more or less in the middle of the territory, which means geographically it is surrounded by neighboring countries, which all of them, with the exception of Lebanon again, are mostly populated by Muslims. We will go later on into detail in order to show how this geopolitical map was created, and we are going to discuss in this lecture how this form of Israel was part of the continuing conflict between Israel and some of its Arab neighboring countries. Let's go back for a second to the second half of the 19th century. At that time, the territory on which Israel is situated today was part of a very large imperial province of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire actually began to collapse politically much earlier, before the creation of the State of Israel. This actually had to do with two main reasons. The first one was the political weakness of the Ottoman regime. The country was heavily decentralized, and all kinds of local political powers, ethnic groups, and ruling elites revolted against the Ottoman Empire and tried to separate several regions from the empire. The second reason was the growing involvement of imperial European powers that began to intervene heavily in the internal affairs of the Ottoman Empire already at the first half of the 19th century, and more or less intensified its involvement in the second half of it. During the second half of the 19th century, several regions of the Ottoman Empire were cut off the empire due to the results of some wars that took place between the Ottoman Empire and European powers. Let me mention only two important wars that had also some influence on the later emergence of the State of Israel. One of them is, of course, the Crimean War, which took place for 3 years between 1853 to 1856, and its result was a weakening of the power of the Ottoman Empire as a military force in the Middle East. The second one, the War of 1876-1878, caused actually the emergence of some independent ethnic states in the Balkans, most important, Romania and Bulgaria. Something like this did not happen yet in the Middle East, but later on we would see that some local powers in the Middle East more or less followed the same process that took place in the Balkans some 40 to 50 years earlier. Now, one has to have in mind that the Middle East was never divided in the way it is divided politically today. There were no political boundaries between the Ottoman provinces of the Middle East. There was no Syria. There was nothing like Iraq. The territory today of today's Jordan, Transjordan, its previous name, did not exist. Actually, there were administrative divisions that more or less presented the form of the 16th and 17th administrative organization of the Ottoman Empire. So how come that after World War I, the Middle East was divided into several countries, and how come that Israel actually was not an outcome of the second half of the 20th century, but rather an outcome of the first half of the 20th century, that is another result of World War I. Actually, it goes back again to late 19th century. After the year 1840, the European powers decided basically not to divide the Ottoman Empire among themselves, rather to leave it in its independent state, but to intervene in its provinces and to kind of establish economic and political basis in several cities and in some regions. For example, France was traditionally much interested in the so-called Levant, the territory of today's Lebanon and Syria. Britain was very interested in Egypt. And actually, what happened after the year 1840 was that almost every European power had its own representatives in the Middle East, either as settlers or merchants active in some sea harbors, or as ethnic groups that became more or less dependent on the patronage and the defendants of the Western powers. If we check the territory of today's Israel before 1948, we can see, for example, that Russia, Imperial Russia, was the traditional supporter of the Greek Orthodox in Palestine. France was the defender of the Catholics. Britain supported the Christian Protestant small minority as well as the Druze. This is a very interesting religious ethnic group, a splinter of the Shiite Islam, and also supported the Jews of the Middle East. But the Ottoman Empire remained an independent political entity until the year 1914. Actually, when one studies the background of the emergence of the State of Israel, it should also check the ethnic structure of the territory that borders today's Israel, and one can see easily that it consisted and still consists of many ethnic minorities and some major religious groups. The most important of all, of course, was the Muslim group, which is divided roughly into the so-called Sunnite and Shiites. Most of the Shiites of the Middle East lived and still live today in today's Iran, in today's Iraq, and in today's Lebanon. The Sunnites are the dominant Muslim group in Egypt, in Palestine, and in Saudi Arabia. But except for the Muslims, there were all kinds of Christian groups in the Middle East, and these groups go back traditionally and historically to the pre-Muslim period of the Middle East, that is to the Byzantine and late Roman period. If we look closely at the ethnic structure of Palestine, today's Israeli territory, we could easily see that Muslims were not 100% the unique population of the territory. There were like 20 to 25% of other minorities. Among them was also the Jewish one. Let me mention the fact that Jews lived in today's Israeli territory much earlier than late 19th century, much before the emergence of modern Jewish nationalism. The Zionist movement, of which I will talk later on, did not bring to Palestine the first Jews. Jews actually lived in Palestine from time immemorial, and although they became quite a small minority in the late Middle Ages, still there were in Palestine some hundreds and some thousands of Jews, depends on the century, depends on the period, and most of them concentrated in 4 cities of Palestine. The largest Jewish community that lived in Palestine before the end of the 19th century was Jerusalem. Surprisingly enough, in Jerusalem, since the year 1940, the Jewish community was the largest religious group of the city. And there were also Jews living in 3 other towns, 2 in South Palestine and 2 in Northern Palestine. Except for that, there were several hundred Jews who lived in agricultural villages among the Muslim and Christian population. That means that historically speaking, the Jews were not new to the country, although they consisted a minority. By the end of the 19th century, before the beginning of modern Jewish settlement of Palestine, Jews more or less consisted between 10 to 15% of the population, but they were not the only minority there, and with the Christians, as I mentioned before, they consisted more or less like 30% of the population. This is very important to remember because actually we are talking of a process of Islamization of the Middle East that had begun already in the 7th and 8th century due to the Arab invasion of the Middle East, and still continued into modernity, into the 19th and 20th century. We should bear in mind also that Islam was the dominant religion of the Ottoman Empire. Although the Ottoman Empire tolerated the autonomy of all non-Muslim religious groups. This will be very important when we discuss the fact that up to the beginning of the 20th century, not only Christians but also Jews had kind of autonomous rule in Palestine, nothing to do with modern Jewish nationalism that emerged later on. Let us also check some other characterizations of the Ottoman Empire before the beginning of modernity that had an impact on the history of the emergence of Israel in the 20th century. What you can see here is, on this map, the fact that you have a territory which is very close to the deserts of Arabia, and an ongoing movement of nomadic Bedouins was flowing from the south into the west and into the north. Actually, it was also kind of a continued activity of Muslim nomadic and military population that moved always to the west and to the north. In the 19th century, most of Palestine actually consisted of a nomadic population that not only lived in the desert areas of southern Palestine, but also lived in the great plains of Palestine, later on Israel, such as the Jordan Valley and the Coastal Valley. Actually, most of the permanent population of Palestine, that is the population of city dwellers and farmers, peasants, called in Arabic falahin, lived in the mountain area. And the Bedouins were actually moving from place to place, and they were actually, if you like, continuing the desert spirit and the desert culture well into the fertile plains of the Middle East, not only in Palestine, but also in Syria and in today's Jordan. Actually, before the beginning of the Jewish settlement of Palestine in the end of the 19th century, there was a rough division of the territory of the Middle East between the plains that were mostly, except for the case of Iraq, populated by nomadic population, and the mountain or hill and mountain area which was populated by peasants and towns dwellers. This represents actually the decline of the centralized system that governed the Middle East before the 16th century, in which more or less great territories of the Middle East became desert. And they became desert because of the fact that they were not cultivated and because the Bedouin culture actually took over and spread to the north and to the west. It is very important to stress this structure of Palestine and the Middle East in general in terms of plain deserts and populated mountain areas, because if we check the form of today's Israeli boundaries, we can see that most of Israeli population, that is the population that grew up as a result of the mass Jewish immigration into the land in the 20th century, is settled in the plains, in those territories that were half vacant or almost vacant and were not cultivated in the 19th century and early 20th century. This also explains the historical fact that when Jews began to settle in Palestine, they were able to purchase great pieces of land in those territories which were regarded half-desert or semi-desert areas. This explains also as well the connection between the nomadization of the Middle East and the relative easiness in which the Jews were able to settle territories in Palestine before World War I, because actually there was no competition over the land at that period, or at least there was no much objection on the side of the local population in terms of purchases of land. On the contrary, it is very interesting to show how the first purchases of pieces of land on which the first Jewish settlements, colonies, were established from the year 1881, 1822, had to do with the fact that these territories were so cheap that they were acquired by landlords in some major towns of Palestine and then were sold to the Jewish new settlers coming from Eastern and Central Europe. Let us go again to the map of the Ottoman Empire for the last time in order to see one more characterization, and that is the form of the Ottoman Empire in geopolitical terms. This will enable us to understand how and why every political creation that one can see on the Middle East map is not older than 60 or 70 years at most. On this map, one can see easily that the Ottoman Empire, except for Anatolia, today's Turkey, was actually spreading to the south and to the east-south, that is, to Iraq on the east, and to Syria, Palestine, and the western coast of Saudi Arabia on the west. A second look at the map shows that already by the end of the 19th century, most of the territories that were Turkish already by the end of the 18th century were not under Ottoman rule anymore. The Balkan on the north, some parts of the Russian Empire that were already taken from the Ottomans during the reign of Catherine II, the second half of the 18th century, Egypt, that was lost forever for the Ottomans in the year 1881, taken by the British, and just before World War I, the Ottoman Empire was more or less consisting of Anatolia and Arab provinces, Arab-populated provinces. Now, it was one entity. There were no political borders, as I mentioned before. And when the empire collapsed after World War I, it was divided roughly between two major powers. The southwest of the Ottoman Empire that you can see on the map was taken by the British. The northwest that you can see on your map was taken by the French, and the southeast, today's Iraq, was taken also by the British. As a result of World War I, and after the deliberations of the League of Nations and the confirmation of some international agreements, Palestine, which never existed before as a separate political entity, became part of the British Empire. To be more exact, the British Empire became the so-called mandatory power, a power that was responsible for the welfare of the population in the territory of Palestine in order to prepare them later on for independence. This mandatory system was ratified and confirmed on March 1920. And from now on, until the 15th of May 48, you have, for the first time, a political entity with geopolitical borders called Palestine. Later on, I will discuss the fact that even this small territory was divided after some years into two parts, one of them to become the principality, or in Arabic, Amirat, of Transjordan, today's Jordan, and the western part, west to the Jordan River, was Palestine. Now, let's again check the territory of Palestine closely. One can see on the map of late Ottoman Empire that there was no separation between Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. Historically speaking, Palestine was called by the Arabs Sovereign Syria, or in Arabic, Syria al-Janubiyya, which means Syria, or Greater Syria, expanded up to the borders of Egypt. There was nothing politically called Palestine. Now, the name Palestine, of course, is very old. It goes back to the Roman period, when in one of the administrative systems of late Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire, this territory was called Palestina, and it was divided into three parts: Palestina Prima, Palestina Secunda, and Palestina Tertia. But this Palestine was only the sovereign and central part of today's Israel. Northern Israel, the Galilee, was part of Syria. In today's Israel, all the area north to the city of Haifa was part of 19th century Syria. And even the population was called Syrian. Nobody ever called them Palestinians. This is very important to understand, since the idea of a nation, of a modern nation regarding the Palestinians, is quite new. It's not older than the late decades of the 19th century, and as a matter of fact, symmetrically, it was a parallel to the emergence of modern Jewish nationalism in Palestine at the same territory at the same time. One last thing to be said about the Ottoman Empire, of course, is the fact that there was no connection whatsoever between ethnic division of a territory and political administrative borders. Christians, Jews, Muslims, Armenians, Egyptian Copts, Druze, you name them, all of them lived on the same provincial territory, and no ethnic group identified its specific nature with administrative or political boundaries. All of this emerged in the Middle East only as a result of the introduction of modern European-like nationalism that actually was involved in creating the political boundaries and also the emergence of specific national, cultural, or ethnic identities. One way or another, to sum up this part of my lecture, the emergence of Israel, or the fact that a Jewish ethnic group created an ethnic, political, cultural entity with geopolitical borders in the Middle East was not an exception. Rather, it was part of the process of disintegration that the Ottoman Empire underwent after World War I. To stress this point, let us check the history of the borders of Palestine. Again, if we go back to today's map of Israel on the background of the Middle East, one can see that Israel borders with 4 Arab neighboring countries: Egypt on the southwest, Jordan on the east, Syria on the northeast, and Lebanon on the north. Now, let us discuss every border in detail for some minutes. Let's start with the Egyptian border. The Egyptian border is the oldest border that was created in the Middle East between Israel and Egypt. It was created as a result of an agreement between the Ottoman Empire and the British Empire as to the boundaries between Egypt and Turkish Palestine. It was actually representing the most eastward post of the British Empire at that time in the Middle East. So this border, which is today's the international recognized border between Israel and Egypt, a border that was ratified in the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt, March 1979, goes back to 1906. Nothing historical, nothing which has to do either with the Israelis or the Egyptian population. It was a straight line from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea that was drawn between the British and the Turks. Now to the Jordanian-Israeli border. What you see on this map actually is not the border that existed between Jordan and Israel before the year 1967. Rather, you see here the border line between Western Palestine, that is mandatory Palestine under the British, and the Kingdom of Jordan, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. This border actually was agreed upon in the year 1922 when the British Empire decided to divide Greater Palestine into 2 parts, Jordan and Palestine. So this border, which leads from the Red Sea via the valley of Arava of the Israeli Negev and the Jordan River up to the Lake of Galilee, was created only in the year 1922. Again, nothing to do with the ethnic population of either Jordan, which at the same time was populated mostly by nomadic Bedouin tribes, and Western Palestine, populated heavily at that time by Muslim Sunnites. the Syrian and Lebanese border with Israel are yet a result of another post-World War I agreement between the British and the French. But behind these final borders that exist actually from the year 1923 up to the present, a long story is to be revealed. Already by 1916, in the middle of World War I, two ministers, one French and one British, Mr. Sykes and Mr. Picot, met together and made a secret agreement as to the result of the war in the Middle East. They decided that Syria will be divided after the war between Britain and France. Now, France demanded that the Galilee, that is the northern part of today's Israel, will be part of the French mandate. Hence, they agreed on a line leading from the city of Haifa to the Lake of Galilee. You can see that it's almost 1/5 of today's Israeli territory. Now, by the year 1917, the British government issued a declaration known as the Balfour Declaration, which was actually proclaimed on the 2nd of November 1917, that promised Palestine, that is Greater Palestine, today's Jordan and today's Israel, to the Jews as a national homeland. This agreement conflicted with the secret agreement of France and Britain. Hence, it promised the Jews much of the future French territory according to the Sykes-Picot agreement. Another agreement was made between the British and the leading group of Arab Bedouin armies that revolted against the Turks and helped the British fighting the Ottoman army in the first years of World War I. The Arab leading family, known as the Hashemite family of Hashem, came from Saudi Arabia, and they were promised by the British that after the war they will get a large Arab independent kingdom, which capital will be the city of Damascus. And the Prince Faisal was supposed to be the king of that large kingdom. In that kingdom, Palestine and Transjordan were supposed to be part of the great Arab independent state. So this was a third conflicting agreement. What happened after the war, that the British and French had long quarrels for some years until they decided on the present borderline between Syria and mandatory Palestine. And as you could see, the Galilee now became part of British Palestine. Syria and Lebanon remained French mandatory political entities, and the borders of 1923 remained actually the borderline recognized internationally by the world until today. Now, to cut a long story short, none of today's Israeli borders has anything to do with the ethnic population of the region. Syria and Lebanon, Jordan and Egypt have imperialistic boundaries with Palestine. None of them was acquired either by the Israelis or by the Arab side. They were only recognized legally because they were part of international agreements. Now let's discuss the relations between the Muslim population of the Middle East and the Jews as a background for better understanding of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Up to now, we have discussed the geopolitical and historical background. Now let's move to the discussion of religion, culture, and the conflict between East and West, or rather, Islam and the West. Historically speaking, the Middle East was occupied by the Arab invasion coming from Saudi Arabia as part of the Muslim invasion of the Mediterranean. Actually, the Muslim new rulers of the territory, which was before mostly Christian, the late Byzantine Empire, of course, was Christian. This new rule was very tolerant towards non-Muslim inhabitants of the countries. Although, according to the holy book of Islam, the Quran, the religion of Islam should be spread by the sword, as they say in Arabic, Din Muhammad Bisayf. Still, they tolerated the existence of large non-Muslim communities. These communities were recognized religiously as long as they were obedient to the ruling Islamic religious law called Al-Sharia, and as long as they followed some restrictions on their behavior. For example, one of the major things that was required from non-Muslims living in Muslim countries was that the houses of prayer, the churches or the synagogues, will not be higher than the mosque, or they should never wear green clothes, because green was and still is, of course, a sacred color in Islam. Other than that, they were tolerated and they had the permission to keep their autonomous religious life and to follow their religion. Actually, Christianity and Judaism were recognized by the Muslims religiously as two religions of the book. And the people who believed in the book, be it the Bible or the New Testament, the Old Testament or the New Testament, were called the people of the book. So the people of the book were admitted, they were tolerated, as long as they were obedient to the Muslims. This system actually survived until the 20th century in all Muslim territories. Not only that it survived into the 20th century, but it enabled the Jews to survive in Muslim countries and to enjoy a relatively calm and peaceful existence. But it was on condition, and the condition was that the Jews and the Christians as well would never dare raise their head, as they say, above the heads of the Muslims. Now, in late 19th century, what happened was that two new elements entered the Middle East. One of them was mentioned here before politically, and that was Western imperialism, be it French, be it Russian, be it British, German, Austrian, etc. The other new thing that came into the Middle East was modern nationalism, another kind of European export to the Middle East and actually to all the world outside of Western, Central, and Eastern Europe. imperialism actually made the Muslim population in the territories occupied or colonized by the French or the British inferior to the Christians. The long-run result of this invasion is still felt today. One of its outcomes is the emergence of very extreme type of Muslim fundamentalism, which major enemy is Western culture, Western powers, and the West in general. Actually, in this regard, the West is regarded as the great Satan of the world. Another thing that happened due to the imperialist invasion of the Middle East was that in the Middle East itself, some minority groups, especially Christian, but also Jewish, and some ethnic groups, for example, the Armenians or the Greek, felt themselves now supported by Western powers, and their system of relation with the local ruling Muslim powers changed enormously. Now they didn't have anymore to be obedient. They could change their status legally, culturally, politically. Let us go back to the Sharia. According to the Sharia, the people of the book were under the protection of the Muslim ruler, of the Khalif, or of the prince, al-Amir, or of any Muslim ruler, be it a head of a tribe or a head of a village or whatsoever. They were called, in the Arab legal term, the protected people. In Arabic, Ahl al-Dhimmah. And or they had to be protected because it was kind of a feudal contract between the protected and the protectors. The protectors had to defend their clients. That means a leader of a Bedouin tribe in Yemen who protected some Jews in a certain community of Yemen had to defend them legally. But it was on the condition that they paid a religious tax, which was called in Arabic jizya. And this money actually was part of the sacred Muslim law, the Sharia. Al-Dhimmah, the protected people, had also, as I mentioned before, to be subordinated and to follow the Sharia in terms of their external behavior. Now, what happened in late 19th century, in early 20th century, that all this very delicate balance between the Muslims and the local population, be they Christian or Jews, changed enormously, because now the protected were protected by others, by new powers, by external powers, by Europeans, by the French, by the British. In Palestine, for example, Jews who lived in Jerusalem were protected by the British Council, they were protected by the French Council. They didn't care anymore to pay their religious tax. They actually began to think themselves superior to the local population. This change of balance had, as I mentioned before, a very important impact on the Muslim mind in the Middle East. The ruling majority actually developed kind of an inferiority feeling, which you can still see today in some of Arab modern writings vis-à-vis the West. Now, the second novelty, modern nationalism. Modern nationalism actually enabled members of ethnic groups in the Middle East to redefine their identity. Hence, people who before regarded themselves as members of a religious, cooperative, autonomous community, a church or something parallel, began to think in nationalistic European terms. They discovered their national history. They began to claim territorial identity with the province in which they lived. They also began to claim identity between political boundaries and ethnic structure of the population. Let us check one crucial example that explains the change that both imperialism and the emergence of modern nationalism brought to the Middle East. On this map, one can see how the large Jewish communities that lived in the Middle East and in North Africa before modernity and were protected by the Muslim local powers, be they in Algeria, in Morocco, in Tunisia, or in Iraq, Syria, or Palestine. Now, members of those communities developed two new types of identity that changed enormously the balance between them and the Muslim population. First, some of them, especially the economic elites of the Jewish society, began to identify themselves with the ruling imperial powers. In Morocco, for example, or in Algeria, Jews began to identify themselves with French culture, with French politics, and in Algeria, which was an exceptional case, they were even granted French citizenship and were preferred over the local Muslim population. Actually, they were regarded by the local population as members of the ruling imperial hated power. Something parallel to this happened, for example, in Iraq after World War I, when Jewish elite, or Jewish economic elites of Iraq began to identify themselves enormously with the British ruling power and acquired the British culture, and later on some of them even emigrated to Britain. The other thing that happened was that new national identity emerged in those Middle Eastern communities. So the Jews, who regarded themselves before as members of a religious group subordinated to the Muslims, now identified itself as a group that is part of a larger nation living in Europe, living in America, living also in Palestine. If we go back to the map, we can see that by the year 1967, none of the traditional Jewish communities that existed in the Middle East for almost 2,000 years continued to exist. Many of them emigrated either to the European power with which their elites began to identify in the 19th century. In this case, you can see how Egyptian Jews, Tunisian Jews, Algerian Jews, or Moroccan Jews emigrated to France. By the way, today's French Jewish community consists mostly of North African Jews coming from North Africa from 1967 on. You can see also that another direction of migration led to Palestine, later on Israel. That is, due to the emergence of modern Jewish nationalism, Jews of the pre-modern communities now emigrated from their home countries and joined the new nation of Israel, which represented for them the nationalistic identity of the new type. Both directions of emigration show how the emergence of modern Jewish nationalism, as well as the identification of the Jews with European powers, changed the balance between the Arab society, or the Muslim Arab society, and the Jews, up to the point that they could not live anymore in their older homes. They had to leave. This is much telling, because if we move now to the discussion of what happened in Palestine, later on to be Israel, one can see easily that the emergence of modern Jewish nationalism in Palestine and the fact that modern type of Jews flocked together into Palestine to become later on Israel, a new type of a Jew emerged, a one who was not anymore a dhimmeh, a protected person or a protected community, and a one who identified itself mainly with the West or with Western culture, or at least had a Western type identity, that is modern Jewish nationalism. Both ways, one could see how the emergence of a new demographic entity, of a new type Jew in Palestine, could lead easily to the emergence of a political conflict. And since I'm talking of the roots of that conflict, one has to bear in mind that much of the negative image of today's Israel in the mind of neighboring Arab populations goes back actually to this change of balance from the protected dhimmeh to the Westerner intruder, the one who took over, the one who changed the traditional balance, the one who actually violated the sacred godly law of obedience of the dhimmeh to the ruling elites. Now, if it were only for a religious or cultural conflict, I suppose that the story which I'm going to describe from now on wouldn't have taken place. Only that the story of the Arab-Israeli conflict transformed rapidly from a cultural and religious conflict into a political conflict of the most extreme type. And it was actually doing with the fact that large numbers of Jewish population emigrated to Palestine. And the fact was that although the territory of Palestine was so small, and although the number of Muslims in the Middle East was already, in the beginning of the century, 100 times greater than the number of the Jews, it still had to do with the image of the Israeli as the invader from the West, the one who is permanently taking over, expanding, not sufficing himself with the territory of Palestine, but having in mind the invasion of Syria, the invasion of Egypt, the invasion of other territories, which had to do with the expansionist nature of the Israelis. Now, in that regard, actually, it was almost inevitable that the wars between Israel and the Arab neighboring countries were first and foremost not wars of competition over specific territories, but had in both minds, that is, the minds of the Muslim neighboring countries and the minds of the Israelis, the image of final total wars for life and for death. One has to understand that much of the existence of Israel until today has to do with a permanent feeling of a small alien political entity living in an ocean of hostile powers. This picture, surprisingly enough, is shared by both Arabs and Israelis. Only that for the Israelis, it is a major internal power for self-defense. And for the Muslims, it is actually the more or less accomplishing of the idea of uprooting the alien Western power in the Middle East. This conflict actually changed forms and the politics changed. But when looking at the map, it was always a war for life and death. Now, between the year 1918 to 1948, during the British rule of Palestine, the Jews did quite well in terms of development. They were able to grow from less than 85,000 Jews before World War I, a number which, by the way, diminished to 56,000 in the year 1918, right after the war, to the number of 650,000 Jews before 1948. Most of the population of Palestine, the Jewish population of Palestine at that time, was added to the Jewish community only in 5 years, between the years 1921 to 1936. In 1929, there were in Palestine only 190,000 Jews. By the year 1936, before the beginning of the so-called Great Arab Revolt, there were in Palestine almost 450,000 Jews. That is, in 7 years, the number of the Jews in Palestine almost tripled itself. What happened that made this enormous wave of migration come to Palestine? Well, after World War I, in the 20s, the British government was ready to enable almost every Jewish immigrant to settle in Palestine. But it was the 20s, and not many Jews wanted to live for Palestine. Most of the Jews at that time emigrated from Eastern and Central Europe to the United States of America. Only that in the year 1924, a new immigration law was ruled in the United States, which restricted enormously the number of Jews coming from Eastern Europe, that is from Russia, Ukraine, Poland, etc., to the United States. From now on, poor persecuted Jews from Central and Eastern Europe could mostly go only to Palestine. But that was not enough. In the late 20s, actually, after the great economic crisis, which was a world crisis that more or less extended from the United States of America to almost every place on earth, many Jews decided that they should go to Palestine. And after the year 1933, when the Nazi Party took over in Germany, Jews even began to look for refuge, for a haven. And only from Germany, in 3 years, 60,000 Jews came to Palestine. So, the Arab neighboring countries, as well as the Arab local population of Palestine, began to feel the great danger of being or becoming, sooner or later, a minority in Palestine. If this massive immigration will continue. The Arab emerging nationalist movement in Palestine now demanded from the British government restrictions on immigration. The British government more or less agreed, not after some meditations. By the year 1939, actually, the so-called White Book of 39 was issued, in which Jewish immigration was restricted to almost a minimum and actually was supposed to stop after some years. Also, land purchases were limited enormously in Palestine by another law of the year 1940. So, while in Europe, in the 30s and 40s, the Holocaust took place, restrictions enabled only few Jews to find refuge in Palestine. It was because of the fact that the Arab or the Palestinian Jewish conflict reached a very high point. That is the point of war for life and death. In 1936, actually, a revolt against the British, which also was aimed against the Jews, tried to strike the new Jewish settlements in Palestine and to restrict them. But the Jewish community of Palestine survived it and actually became even much stronger after this revolt ended just before World War II began in the year 1939. But it was the time when some people in Israel began to understand that there is no chance that this conflict would be solved peacefully because of the fact that the Arabs continued this idea of the Western intruder imposed on the Jews, and the Jews, due to the Holocaust and due to the restrictions on immigration to other countries, had to find refuge. And this was again a war for life and death. The three wars that took place between the Israelis and the Arabs after the decision or the resolution of the United Nations on the 29th of November 1947 on the partition of Palestine is much argued by historians. But one thing is clear. When the UN made this resolution, the Jews or the Jewish community in Palestine was ready to compromise on part of Palestine to become an independent Jewish political entity, later on Israel. The Palestinian population was not ready to compromise and began a civil war against the Jewish population of Palestine. This war, surprisingly enough, did not end with the winning of the Palestinian side, but by April 1948, 1 month before the declaration of independence of Israel, the Jewish side was strong enough to win in almost every part of Palestine, up to the point that there was no real danger from the Palestinian local population. Then the real war began. After the 15th of May of 1948, neighboring Arab countries invaded the territory of Palestine, trying to destroy the newly created state of Israel. Israel was strong enough not only to survive the first attack, but after some months, it took over much more territory than the UN allotted to it, according to the resolution of 29th of November 1947. By the end of the year 1948, Israel was so strong that it invaded Egypt, that it was ready to attack Syria, and it was also ready to take the rest of Palestine. But at that time, Armistice Agreements were achieved, and Israel finished the war with a much larger territory than the territory that was allotted to it by the United Nations. Now, the Armistice Agreements were described, and when one reads carefully the text, they are described as the first stage for peace agreement between Israel and the neighboring countries. But no peace was achieved. On the contrary, between the years 1949 and 1967, Israel, a very small political entity, and have in mind the map of Israel, which you see in front of you, on the right side of the page, you see that the largest Israeli city, Tel Aviv, is only less than 10 miles from the Jordanian border, and that Jerusalem, the capital city of Israel, was just on the border. And the largest part of Israel, which was not under direct danger of artillery shelling, was only in the desert of the Negev, somewhere south to the city of Be'er Sheva. Now, the size of Israel and the fact that it looked from the outside so vulnerable tempted the Arab neighboring countries not to agree to the sheer existence of the State of Israel. Actually, even today, even after signing peace with two major Arab countries, neighboring countries, that is, of course, Egypt and Jordan, it is not that the existence of Israel is recognized in the deep meaning of the word. It is recognized because it's an existing entity, not because it has its right to exist. It's very sad to observe, but this refusal is also part and parcel of the problems Israel has this day with the Palestinian population. But let's go back to what happened in the year 1967. In June 1967, the leader of Egypt, Jamal Abdel Nasser, decided that this is the right time to accomplish the thing that was not accomplished in 1948. That is, to destroy the so-called, in Arabic, the Zionist entity called Israel. He actually made a blockade on Israel, and if you look at the left side map, you can see how the Sinai Peninsula could enable the Egyptian Navy to blockade Israel from the south by locking the Strait of Tiran leading to the Gulf of Eilat, or the Gulf of Aqaba, between Saudi Arabia and the Sinai Peninsula. Israel actually retaliated by attacking both Egypt and Syria. And since it was also heavily shelled by Jordanian artillery, it retaliated by invading the western territories of Jordan, which were actually parts of mandatory Western Palestine. The results of the war could be seen on the left map again. Now you had, after 6 days of war, Greater Israel, from the Suez Canal up to the Golan Heights in the northeast. Again, after 1967, no peace agreement was signed between Israel and the Arab neighboring countries. On the contrary, the Arab nations convened a conference in Khartoum, in Sudan, and decided the famous 3 no's. No to peace, no to recognition, no to agreement. And after 6 years, another war broke out. This time, this war actually was the worst ever fought by Israel, because Israel was taken by surprise by both Egypt and Syria. One could see on the central maps the situation in the Egyptian side and on the Syrian side. While in the Egyptian side, one could see that the first stage of the war was actually won by the Egyptian army. The Egyptian army was able to cross the Suez Canal and take some 10 kilometers of Israeli Sinai Peninsula held territory. But after 10 days only, the situation was reversed. The Israeli army was able to cross the canal and to invade parts of Egypt and to reach a spot on the road between Suez City and Cairo, which was only 100 kilometers from Cairo. On the northern frontier, the situation in the beginning was much worse. The Syrian army almost reached the Jordan River and was able to go down to the Galilee, northern Israel. But after some days, the Israeli army was able not only to drive out the Syrian army from the Golan Heights, but also to take a great chunk of the territory between the Golan Heights and Damascus. This war actually was a major proof to the greater military ability of Israel, that even it was taken by a sudden attack, and even at the starting point, both the Egyptian front and the Syrian front were so desperate, after some days the Israelis were able to change the situation and to reverse the war from almost a defeat into a glorious victory. It's very interesting to observe that the result of the war was very different on the Syrian side and on the Egyptian side. While on the Egyptian side, the president of Egypt at that time, Anwar al-Sadat, was ready to consider, first of all, an armistice agreement with Israel, and then a separation of powers agreement. And then he even reached the point that in the year 1977, he was ready to consider a peace agreement with Israel. On the Syrian side, nothing like that happened. The difference goes to the fact that actually, from the Egyptian point of view of that time, the military power of Israel was regarded as a sign that the solution for the conflict would be never achieved by power. It's a paradox. The power of Israel brought the idea that power would not win the war. On the Syrian side, however, under the leadership of Hafez al-Assad, the situation did not change. Actually, although the Syrian army was defeated, and it has been proved to the Syrians that even by a sudden attack, Israel is able to revive itself and to win the war, the Syrians were not ready to consider a type of agreement like the one that took place with the Egyptians. Let me now analyze in some summing remarks the relation between today's Israeli situation among the Arab nations and the long roots of the conflict which go back to late Ottoman Empire. First of all, Israel emerged as one of the nation states that popped up after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. In that regard, it was not different from Jordan, which actually received its independence on August 1948, or from Syria that became an independent state in the year 1936, same with Lebanon. All these are new political creations that emerged in the Middle East due to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Second, Israel was and still is, as a matter of fact, a different entity in a Muslim Arab territory. It is very difficult still today to compromise between the ideas, the cultures, the political structures, as well as the different and almost conflicting aims of Israel and its neighboring countries. Have in mind, for example, the fact that in some school books in Arab countries, one cannot find Israel on the map. It does not exist. There is a blank white stain on the map. Or you have something called Palestine, that is the future Arab state to become if Israel would ever disappear from the map. So it is very, very difficult to foresee the outcome of the conflict, because we have here a conflict that has to bridge gaps, cultural gaps, religious gaps, political gaps. And so far, much of the conflict was determined by balance of powers. And since Israel was still powerful enough to survive, it maintained its independent existence. Israeli power rests on the point that the Israelis actually managed to create a modern, Western-minded society with moral values that are based on European-type nationalism of late 19th century. Israel won the wars mainly because of the fact that it is a modern, democratic Western society which was able to mobilize its population in times of emergency. But at the same time, achieving peace is a major goal because in the long run, one cannot know how many centuries such a small political entity could survive without changing the political and cultural atmosphere around it. Again, I am a professor of history. I'm not a prophet, but I might say that one of the major differences that gives Israel its power is the fact that it is a democracy. And this is one of the major mistakes that has been made by Arab neighboring societies, identifying Israel's democracy with weakness. Because in Israel, as the old Jewish saying goes, when you have two Jews, you have three opinions. And in Israel, no two politicians would agree even on the same military decision. But still, it has been proved in 48 and in 67 and in 73 that if a country is strong enough, it could survive even in an ocean of hostile cultures. And again, this hostility is not an invention of the year 1948, and it's not even a result of the Balfour Declaration of 1917. This hostility goes back to the destruction of the traditional balance between the protectors and the protégés, the protector and the dhimme, the Arab Muslim ruling elites, and one of these small ethnic groups that challenged it and claimed independence and claimed different identity and succeeded politically in achieving it. Thank you very much for your listening, and goodbye to you all.